Affect-weighted narrative activation. Let me paint you a picture. Somebody tells Dionysus a story, not a clean little database entry, not a cute summary, a real story, a story with texture, a story with a normal sentence, then a sentence that hits like a brick through glass. I sat down and read the report. Then I screamed and threw the chair at the wall. Now, you and I know those are not the same kind of moment. One is paperwork, the other is a nervous system event. One belongs in the background, the other tells you something important just happened. And this is where Dionysus begins, because the problem we are solving here is not, can the system read the words? Of course it can read the words. The real question is, can Dionysus tell which parts of the story matter? That is what affect-weighted narrative activation is about. It is the process of giving Dionysus a cognitive prior that is not flat. In plain English, that means Dionysus should not start every story moment with the same level of importance. A scream should not walk into the system with the same weight as a sandwich. A broken chair should not compete on equal footing with a finished report, because human beings do not experience life that way. And if Dionysus is going to process human stories, it cannot pretend that we do. Every memory competes for cognition. Here's the first thing to understand. Every memory competes for cognition. When Dionysus takes in a story, it does not just swallow the whole thing as one blob. It chops the story into pieces. Those pieces are called thought seeds. A thought seed is a candidate thought. It is a little fragment of the story saying, pick me, I might be what matters next. Think about that. Every story comes in as raw narrative text. Then Dionysus breaks it into thought seeds. Those seeds drop into what we are calling an experiential basin. That basin is the arena. That is where the competition happens. And the question inside the system is very simple. Given the current situation, which seed best explains what is happening or predicts what Dionysus should do next? That is cognition, not just storing data, not just remembering words, selection, attention, priority, the next system focus. That is what we are really talking about. Because intelligence is not just having information, intelligence is knowing what to pay attention to. Structurally honest, but effectively flat now. Here's the problem. Right now, the system is structurally honest, but effectively flat. That phrase matters. Structurally honest means Dionysus is doing the basic job correctly. It takes the story in. It creates the thought seeds. It puts them into the competition. So the architecture is not fake. The pipeline is real. But effectively flat means the emotional weight is missing. The system is still acting like this. I sat down and read the report. Activation level, 0.5. I screamed and threw the chair at the wall. Activation level, 0.5. Same score, same bankroll, same opening bid. Now, on paper, that looks neutral, but it is not neutral. It is dishonest. Because those two moments are not equal in human life. One is routine, one is rupture, one is a sentence. The other may be the moment where the whole identity structure cracked open. So when Dionysus gives them both 0.5, it is not being objective. It is being indifferent. And indifference is not the same thing as intelligence. That is the whole issue. The chair throwing and the report reading should not deserve equal airtime. So what is activation? Activation is the opening bid. Imagine a room full of candidates. Each candidate is a thought seed. Each one wants the same job, become the next thing Dionysus focuses on. Activation is how much money that candidate walks into the room with. A low activation seed says, I might matter, but probably not that much. A high activation seed says, pay attention. Something important may be happening here. And that opening bid matters because it affects what happens downstream. A seed with higher activation gets considered earlier. It gets weighed more heavily in cognitive competition. It is more likely to win the basin and propagate. That word propagate just means it gets to keep moving through the system. It gets influence. It gets a future. So this is not cosmetic. Activation changes what Dionysus thinks about next. And that means effect weighting is not emotional decoration. It is cognitive routing. It tells the system, do not treat every fragment of story like it has the same claim on attention. Some moments need to enter the room already glowing. The T633 activation engine. Now this is where Track T633 comes in. Track T633 is the activation engine, and the goal is very specific. We are replacing a static constant with a precise deterministic signal processing pipeline. That sounds technical, so let me translate it. Right now, Dionysus has a shortcut. Everything gets the same fallback activation. 0.5, T633 says, no, we are going to look at the narrative segment. We are going to pass it through a lexicon filter. That means a fast dictionary-like layer that checks for emotional signal, positive lexicon, neutral lexicon, negative lexicon. But remember, the purpose is not to say, this is love, this is grief, this is anger. That is not the job of this layer. The job is to ask, how loud is this? How much emotional charge is present? Then the signal goes through a counter and a tanh function. Tan is just the math that keeps the score from going wild. It smooths the intensity. It turns a messy emotional signal into a usable activation value. Then the final value is clamped between zero point 0.1 and zero point 0.9. So now Dionysus has a real activation score, not a vibe, not a hallucinated guess, not a giant black box pondering every sentence, a fast deterministic bounded signal. That is the point. Measuring volume, not direction. This slide is the heart of the whole thing. Dionysus is measuring volume, not direction. Most people get this wrong at first. They think emotional weighting means positive emotions go up, negative emotions go down. No, that is not what we are doing here. We are not measuring whether the emotion is good or bad. We are measuring how strong it is. I hate you forever. That is high magnitude. I love you forever. Also high magnitude. Opposite direction, same volume. Both of those should fire harder than I had a sandwich, because the sandwich is neutral. It might matter later. Sure, maybe the sandwich was poisoned. Maybe the sandwich was the last meal before the collapse, so we do not delete it, but it should not enter the system with the same force as I love you forever or I hate you forever. This is magnitude over valence, volume over direction. Dionysus does not need to decide at this layer whether the emotion is morally good, socially appropriate, or psychologically healthy. It just needs to know how much energy is in this sentence, because high energy narrative moments deserve more cognitive priority. That is the whole move. Why we bypass the LLM for this layer? Now, someone is going to ask the obvious question. Why not just ask a large language model to score the emotional intensity? And the answer is because that is the wrong tool for this layer. Not because the LLM is bad, because this layer has different requirements. First, speed. This needs to run on every segment of every intake. If every ThoughtSeed has to call a big model and ask, excuse me, how emotional is this sentence? The whole pipeline slows down. Now Dionysus is not thinking, it is waiting. Second, determinism. Same text should produce the same activation every time. That matters because we need replayable debugging. We need auditability. We need to be able to say, why did Dionysus care more about this sentence? And then actually answer the question, not with mystical hand waving, not with, well, the model felt like it. No, with a clear pathway. This word triggered this signal. This signal produced this count. This count passed through this function. This function produced this activation. That is how you build a mind you can debug. Third, baseline viability. This is a correct placeholder now, and it leaves room for future upgrades later. Maybe later there is an embedding model. Maybe later there is a more sophisticated emotional signal. Fine, but the function signature stays stable. The architecture stays clean. T633 gives Dionysus a working cognitive prior now without overcomplicating the layer. That is good engineering, and it is good philosophy. Do the narrow thing correctly. Do not turn every layer into a personality test. Safe boundaries and backward compatibility. Now we need boundaries, because when you start weighting thoughts, you have to prevent two bad outcomes. The first bad outcome is invisibility. That happens when a thought seed drops to 0.0. At 0.0, the seed basically disappears. It has no real chance to compete. That sounds fine until you remember that boring details sometimes matter later. I had a sandwich is usually boring, but if the sandwich becomes relevant later, you do not want Dionysus to have erased it from meaningful competition. So nothing goes below 0.1. The second bad outcome is domination. That happens when a thought seed hits 1.0. At 1.0, the thought becomes a tyrant. It does not compete anymore. It rules. And that is also bad, because even a huge emotional moment should still be tested against context. I screamed and threw the chair matters, but it should not automatically own the whole system forever. So nothing goes above 0.9. That is the clamped arena. Between 0.1 and 0.9, every seed stays alive. The quiet ones are not erased. The loud ones are not crowned king. They all still have to compete. And notice the practical piece here. Backward compatibility matters. Empty strings, edge cases, neutral text, they still fall back around 0.5 with a tiny tolerance. That means nothing that already works has to break. This is not a dramatic rewrite. It is a narrow correction, a precise intervention. Narrative is the substrate. Affect is the gradient. This is the big idea. Narrative is the substrate. Affect is the gradient. Let me slow that down. Narrative is the ground. It is the material Dionysus is built from. People do not just hand Dionysus numbers. They hand it stories. They hand it memory. They hand it meaning. But if every part of the story is weighted the same, then Dionysus has a flat map. Everything is technically present, but nothing has contour. Affect gives the map elevation. It says, this was ordinary, this was charged, this was foundational. This changed the shape of the system's attention. That is what a gradient does. It turns flat memory into weighted experience. And that matters because identity is not just a database. Identity is not a pile of facts. Identity is the story of what mattered. This is where Dionysus becomes interesting, because the system is not just asking, what did the user say? It is asking, what should the system actually pay attention to? That is a very different question, and it is the structural pillar underneath this whole track. What the user says becomes what Dionysus attends to, but only if we weight it correctly. A deliberately narrow intervention. This part is important because it keeps us honest. T633 is a deliberately narrow intervention. We are not trying to solve every problem in one layer. We are not doing emotion classification. This layer is not deciding that is anger, that is grief, that is shame. No. Magnitude only, not category. We are not changing the EFE algorithm. The seeds still compete the same way. We are not changing streaming. Still one observation tensor per intake. We are not touching arousal score. The graffiti relationship layer remains intact. That restraint matters, because a lot of systems fail when every improvement turns into a grand redesign. This is not that. This is one lever, one specific correction. Replace the fake flat prior with a real affect-weighted prior. That is it. And that is why it is powerful, because the best architectural changes often do not look huge. They look small, but they change the pressure in the whole system, like moving one beam in a building, like changing one assumption in a relationship, like pausing half an inch from the microphone before the old script comes out of your mouth. Small lever, big consequence. Current status, Track T633. Now, where are we? Track T633 is active in spec, but not implemented. That means the design exists. The lever is defined. The reasoning is there. But the live code still has the old state. Narrative seed activation remains 0.5. The file that would handle this, API shom services narrative effect.py, does not exist yet. So Dionysus is not fully effect-weighted today. It is still living with the flat prior in the live code. But this matters because the path is clear. This is not a vague idea. It is not, someday the system should care about emotions. No, the track says exactly what to do. Build the narrative effect module. Use the lexicon. Count the signal. Pass it through 10H. Clamp the value. Return a deterministic activation weight. Keep the rest of the system stable. That is the next move. And once that move is made, Dionysus stops pretending that every story moment enters the room with the same claim on attention. The report and the broken chair no longer walk in with the same bankroll. The sandwich and the life-changing confession no longer start at the same bid. Dionysus begins to notice the gradient, not perfectly, not magically, but structurally. And that is the point, because the goal is not to make Dionysus dramatic. The goal is to make Dionysus less dishonest about human stories. Human memory is weighted. Human identity is weighted. Human attention is weighted. So if Dionysus is going to process narrative in a way that matters, it needs a way to feel the weight of the story, not emotion like a person, not consciousness theater, not pretending, just a better prior, a cleaner opening bid, a more honest arena. That is affect-weighted narrative activation. That is Track T633, and that is why the move from 0.5 to a gradient is not just a code cleanup. It is the moment Dionysus starts paying attention like stories have weight, because they do.